Chapter 1. The Iron Serpent's Slumber. The rhythmic clatter of steel on steel was a lullaby to some, a maddening metronome to others. On board the midnight excursion, a luxury locomotive slicing through the remote northern territories, opinions varied. Odessa Vance, a journalist whose byline had seen better days, found it grating. She tapped a pen against her notepad, the blank page a stark reflection of her current assignment, a puff piece on opulent rail travel. Her editor called it a softball. Odessa called it a sentence. Across the aisle in their private suite, Jessa and Kaelin were oblivious to any discordant notes. Newlyweds, their world was confined to stolen glances and soft laughter. Jessa rested her head on Kaelin's shoulder, the plush velvet of the seat a cocoon. "Isn't this romantic?" she murmured, her breath warm against his neck. Kaelin squeezed her hand. "Everything's romantic with you." He meant it mostly. The train was undeniably impressive, a relic of a bygone era of travel, all polished brass and dark wood paneling. Yet an unshakable prickle of unease had settled under his skin since they'd left the last major city hours ago. He dismissed it as wedding jitters lingering. Further down the observation car, little Samuel Sammy Good sat cross-legged on a swiveling armchair, nose almost pressed to the reinforced window. He was 8, traveling with a stern-faced nanny who currently napped in their compartment. Sammy wasn't looking at the blur of pine trees. He was watching the sky, a bruised purple in the fading light. He'd seen a flicker up there, something that wasn't a star or a plane. He clutched a crayon, his small drawing pad open on his lap. He started to sketch, not the landscape, but the strange, shifting light he thought he perceived. The train's intercom crackled, a smooth, practiced voice filling the carriages. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently passing through the Monashee corridor. Due to the unique atmospheric conditions in this region, you may experience some minor turbulence or temporary interference with electronic devices. Rest assured, this is perfectly normal." Odessa snorted quietly. Unique atmospheric conditions, code for we're in the middle of nowhere and the signal's shot. She glanced at her laptop. The Wi-Fi icon was indeed grayed out. She made a note, "Service blackout in Monashee corridor. Check for passenger complaints, Ray. Luxury experience." The lights in the carriage flickered once, twice. A collective murmur went through the passengers. Kaelin instinctively tightened his arm around Jessa. "Probably just what the man said," he offered, trying to sound reassuring. Jessa shivered. "It feels colder suddenly." It wasn't just the temperature. A subtle pressure change, like the air thickening, pressed against Odessa's eardrums. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels beneath them altered, becoming slightly less distinct, as if muffled by an unseen blanket. Sammy stopped drawing. He stared intently out the window, his crayon hovering. The bruised purple of the sky seemed to deepen, swirling in patterns that defied meteorological explanation. "Did you see that?" A man with spectacles, Albin Ferrier, an elderly horologist, asked his seatmate, a burly individual in a rumpled suit who introduced himself as Doc Hector Ramsey. Ferrier pointed a trembling finger towards the window. "The trees. They seemed to ripple." Doc Ramsey squinted. "Old eyes, Albin, or this fancy booze is stronger than I figured." He took another sip from his glass, but he, too, felt a peculiar sensation, a slight disorientation. The lights flickered again, this time staying off for a full 3 seconds. A few nervous gasps. When they returned, they hummed with a slightly different pitch. Odessa frowned. The quality of the light seemed altered, harsher. She glanced at her watch. The second hand was stuttering. She tapped the crystal. It continued its erratic dance. "Odd," she muttered. In their suite, Jessa sat up. "Kalen, my phone. It's completely dead. Not just no signal, it won't even turn on." Kalen pulled out his own. Same result. "Battery must have drained faster than I thought, or it's this corridor they mentioned." He tried to sound casual, but the prickle of unease intensified, spreading like a cold stain. Sammy was now drawing furiously. His crayon, a dark blue, moved in jagged, aggressive strokes. He wasn't looking out the window anymore. He was drawing something from his mind, something that seemed to coalesce in the very air of the train car. The train gave a sudden, violent lurch, not sideways but almost downwards, as if dropping a few inches. Crockery rattled in the dining car. A woman cried out. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated." The intercom crackled, the voice now strained, losing its earlier smoothness. "We are experiencing some unexpected interference. Our engineers are addressing the situation." Odessa gripped her armrests. This was more than turbulence. The air itself felt wrong, charged with a static that made the hairs on her arms stand up. The scent of ozone, sharp and metallic, pricked her nostrils. Alban Ferrier gasped, his face pale. "The time," he exclaimed, pointing to the ornate clock at the end of the observation car. Its hands were spinning wildly, a blur of gold. "It's impossible." Doc Ramsey stared, his jaw slack. "All right, that ain't the booze." The train began to slow, not smoothly but with a series of jarring, grinding shudders. The rhythmic clatter ceased, replaced by a high-pitched whine that seemed to vibrate in their bones. Outside the windows, the landscape was no longer a blur of trees. It was a swirling vortex of indistinct colors, sickly greens and deep violets, like an oil slick on an infinite canvas. There were no discernible shapes, no horizon, just a nauseating, depthless churn. "What is that?" Jessa whispered, her voice trembling, her face pressed against Kalen's chest. Kalen had no answer. He stared out at the impossible vista, his heart hammering. Sammy dropped his crayon. He covered his ears, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended childish fear. He whimpered. Odessa felt a wave of nausea. She fought it down. This was not a story about luxury rail travel anymore. This was something else. Something terribly, fundamentally wrong. The high-pitched whine intensified, building to an unbearable crescendo. Then, with a final, deafening shriek of tortured metal and a gut-wrenching lurch, the train shuddered to a halt. Silence descended, thick and absolute, broken only by the ragged breathing of the passengers. The swirling colors outside the windows slowly, agonizingly, began to resolve, not into the expected wilderness, but into something else. Through the settling chaos of light, faint, steady points of illumination appeared. Gas lamps, perhaps. And then the outline of a building. A very large, very old-fashioned building. A train station. The intercom crackled one last time, the voice almost a whisper, devoid of any human inflection. "Welcome to Providence." Then it went dead. Odessa stared out the window. The swirling miasma had completely dissipated, replaced by the sight of a grand, if somewhat dilapidated, station platform bathed in the soft glow of gaslights. A sign, its paint faded but legible, read, "Providence Station." Beyond it, she could make out the faint shapes of a small town. It looked peaceful, deceptively so. A chill, unrelated to the ambient temperature, traced a path down her spine. This place was not on any map she knew, and the midnight excursion was most definitely not supposed to stop here. The journey had veered wildly off course into a place that felt like the edge of nowhere, or perhaps somewhere else entirely. The unease that had simmered within the passengers began to crystallize into a cold, sharp dread. This was no ordinary delay. This was an arrival. Chapter 2: Providence Station. The silence in the train car stretched, taut and brittle. Passengers exchanged bewildered, fearful glances. The ornate clock at the end of the car was still, its hands frozen at an impossible angle. Outside, Providence Station lay bathed in the soft, steady glow of gas lamps that lined its platform. It had an air of forgotten grandeur, its Victorian architecture hinting at a more prosperous past. Heavy wooden doors, intricately carved, promised entry into a substantial station house. What is this place?" Jessa whispered, her grip on Kaelin's arm painfully tight. "I've never heard of Providence Station." Kaelin shook his head, his own confusion a knot in his stomach. "Me neither. Maybe it's an unscheduled stop, an emergency." But the calmness of the scene outside belied any emergency. There were no scurrying officials, no signs of distress. Only the quiet station waiting. Odessa Vance pushed herself up from her seat, her journalist's instincts, long dormant, beginning to stir despite the cold apprehension. "Stay here," she told the silent carriage, though her voice carried little authority. She moved towards the train door, her steps measured. Doc Ramsey grunted. "Like we got a choice, ain't seen any crew since that thing started." He was right, the train's staff seemed to have vanished. As Odessa reached the door, it hissed open with a surprising smoothness, revealing a short set of steps leading down to the platform. The air that drifted in was cool, smelling faintly of damp earth and something else. Something sweetish and cloying like overripe fruit. A figure emerged from the shadowed doorway of the station house. He was a portly man, dressed in an immaculate, old-fashioned station master's uniform, complete with a peaked cap. A wide, beaming smile stretched his face, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Those eyes, small and bright, seemed to absorb the gaslight rather than reflect it. "Welcome, welcome," he boomed, his voice hearty, perhaps a little too hearty. He spread his arms wide. "Mr. Abernathy Comstock, station master at your service. So glad you could make it to Providence." Odessa paused on the top step, her hand gripping the rail. "Make it? We weren't scheduled to stop here. What's going on? Where are we?" Comstock chuckled, a rich, rolling sound. "Ah, schedules, such rigid things. Sometimes the journey takes an unexpected, delightful turn, wouldn't you agree? Providence has a way of finding those who need to be here." His smile widened if possible. "As for where you are, well, you're in Providence, my dear. A haven, a respite." Passengers began to stir, drawn by the appearance of an authority figure, however strange. Kaelin helped a trembling Jessa to her feet. "We need to know what's happened to the train, to the crew," Kaelin called out, his voice firm despite the tremor he felt. Comstock nodded sagely. "The Iron Serpent is tired naturally after such an energetic passage. She'll need a rest. And the crew, oh, they're being seen to, tended to, you have my word." He gestured towards the station house. "Come now out of the chill. We have warmth, refreshment. Providence welcomes all its weary travelers." Little Sammy Good, still clutching his drawing pad, peered past Odessa, his eyes fixed on Mr. Comstock. The station master's smile seemed to falter for a microsecond as his gaze met the child's, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths before the joviality returned full force. Sammy shrunk back slightly. Odessa noticed the exchange. She also noticed the way Comstock's uniform, though immaculate, seemed a size too small, straining slightly at the buttons over his ample stomach. And the Swedish smell was stronger now, emanating faintly from him. Albin Ferrier, the horologist, was muttering to himself, "Time, the clocks, this place defies chronology." He looked at Comstock with deep suspicion. Now, no need for long faces," Comstock chided gently. "Providence is a place of peace. Let's get you all settled." Slowly, hesitantly, passengers began to disembark. The platform was solid under their feet, made of weathered stone. Odessa took a deep breath of the strange air. It felt heavy, oppressive, despite Comstock's cheerful demeanor. Another figure emerged from the station house, younger than Comstock. A young man in a slightly ill-fitting bellhop uniform with an unnervingly wide, fixed grin plastered on his face. "Bags, sirs, madams, Timmy's here to help." His voice was a little too high-pitched, his eagerness almost manic. His eyes darted from passenger to passenger. Jessa clung to Kaelin. "I don't like this, Kaelin. I don't like this at all." "It's okay," Kaelin said, trying to reassure himself as much as her. "We'll figure it out. Maybe there's a phone in the station. We can call for help." The welcome committee began to materialize as more passengers gathered on the platform. A woman with a rosy complexion, Martha Perkins, appeared carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Fresh pies, dearies, just out of the oven." Her smile was as wide as Comstock's, her eyes a little vacant. Another man, tall and lanky, wearing a tarnished star on his vest, Sheriff Brody, nodded curtly. "No trouble here in Providence. You're safe with us." His voice was flat, monotonous. Each member of this committee seemed off. Their movements were a fraction too rehearsed, their smiles too fixed, their pleasantries delivered with an almost desperate insistence. Odessa watched them, her journalistic sense for a story now fully engaged, overriding some of her fear. This wasn't just an unscheduled stop, it was a performance. But for whose benefit? And to what end? She looked around the station. It was grand, as she'd first observed, but signs of decay were evident on closer inspection. Paint peeled from the ornate window frames, and a section of the roof sagged precariously. Yet the gas lamps burned bright and steady, casting an unearthly, perpetual twilight. There was no sign of electrical wiring, no hint of modern technology. Sammy tugged on Odessa's jacket. He held up his drawing pad. It was a childish scrawl, but Odessa could make out a distorted, portly figure with too many teeth and eyes that were just black circles. The figure stood before a train. "Bad man," Sammy whispered, his voice barely audible. He pointed subtly at Mr. Comstock, who was currently charming an elderly couple with offers of hot tea. Odessa felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She looked from the drawing to Comstock, then back to Sammy. The child's intuition was often more potent than adult logic. "Come along, everyone, into the warmth," Comstock called, gesturing grandly towards the station's main doors. "Providence awaits." The passengers, a bewildered flock, began to move towards the entrance, drawn by the promise of shelter and answers, however illusory they might be. Odessa hesitated, watching Jessa and Kalen being steered gently by Timmy the bellhop. Jessa looked back at Odessa, her eyes wide with a silent plea. This was not a haven. Odessa was sure of it. This was something else. A beautifully constructed stage for a play she didn't understand, but one whose final act she suspected would be anything but delightful. With a deep breath, she followed the others into the waiting maw of Providence Station. Chapter 3: The Whispers of Welcome. The interior of Providence Station was cavernous, the ceiling arching high above, lost in shadows where the gaslight failed to reach. A massive, unlit chandelier hung like a dormant spider. The air was cooler here, thick with the scent of dust, old wood, and that same cloying sweetness Odessa had noticed on the platform, now stronger, almost suffocating. It seemed to emanate from the very walls. Polished wooden benches lined the perimeter of the main hall, their surfaces gleaming unnaturally in the dim light. A grand ticket booth, its window dark and empty, stood against one wall. Mr. Abernathy Comstock beamed, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "Comfortable, isn't it? Built to last, our Providence Station, a true sanctuary." Most passengers huddled together, uncertain. Some slumped onto the benches, weary from the ordeal on the train. Others, like Kalen, looked around for a telephone, a timetable, any sign of conventional operation. There were none. "Refreshments are being prepared in the lounge," Comstock announced, gesturing towards an arched doorway. "Martha's pies are legendary, I assure you." Martha Perkins, the pie woman, simpered nearby, her basket still clutched tightly. Odessa watched Sammy. The boy had found a relatively secluded corner and was drawing again, his small face tight with concentration. He seemed oblivious to the station master's pronouncements. Jessa, pale and shaken, leaned heavily against Kalen. "I want to go home," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We will, Jess. We just need to figure out what's happening," Kalen replied, though his own confidence was rapidly eroding. The station felt wrong. The silence between Comstock's pronouncements was too deep, the smiles of the townsfolk too brittle. Timmy the bellhop approached them, his grin unwavering. "Tired. The Haven Inn is just a short walk. Best beds in Providence. Miss Croft will take good care of you." "An inn?" Kalen asked, surprised. "There's a town." "Oh yes," Timmy chirped. "Providence is a lovely little place, peaceful, you'll see." He made a subtle gesture, almost a herding motion, towards a side exit. Before Kalen could respond, A new sound drifted through the station, faint at first, then clearer. It was a woman's voice, sobbing. A heartbroken, desolate sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Several passengers looked around, startled. "What was that?" a nervous man asked. Comstock's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "The wind, my friend, just the old station settling. It has many stories to tell, many voices in its bones." But Odessa knew wind when she heard it. This was different. This was grief, raw and palpable. It sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the station's chill. The weeper in the walls, she thought, recalling the stories her grandmother used to tell about houses that held sorrow. Alban Ferrier, the horologist, was examining a massive grandfather clock in the main hall. Its pendulum was still, its face dusty. "This clock hasn't run in decades," he announced to anyone who would listen. "Yet the station master," he speaks as if time flows normally here. Sheriff Brody moved towards Ferrier, his expression unreadable. "No need to trouble yourself with old things, mister. Best to focus on the now." His tone was mild, but there was an undercurrent of something harder. Ferrier recoiled slightly. Odessa decided to approach Comstock directly. "Mr. Comstock," she began, her voice firm, "we need some straight answers. What is this place, really? And how do we contact the outside world? There must be a telegraph, a radio." Comstock turned to her, his jovial mask firmly in place. "My dear Miss Vance, is it? Such impatience. Providence offers a slower pace, a chance to disconnect. As for contact, why would you wish to leave so soon? We have so much to offer." His gaze lingered on her, and for a moment Odessa felt a profound, primal fear. It was like looking into the eyes of a predator disguised in ill-fitting human skin. The sobbing sound came again, closer this time, seeming to emanate from the very stone of the walls around them. Several passengers gasped. Jessa buried her face in Kalen's coat. "Please make it stop," she begged. Timmy the bellhop clapped his hands together with forced cheerfulness. "Who's for the inn? A warm bed awaits. Ms. Croft is expecting you." He practically strong-armed Jessa and Kalen towards the side exit. Kalen looked back, a desperate appeal in his eyes, but he allowed himself and Jessa to be led away. The prospect of a bed of some semblance of normalcy was too tempting to resist, despite the pervading wrongness. Odessa watched them go, a sense of foreboding settling over her. She turned her attention back to Sammy. He was holding up a new drawing. It depicted a woman with long, dark hair, her face obscured by shadows, her form seeming to merge with a brick wall. Tears, drawn as black streaks, ran down the bricks. "She's sad," Sammy whispered. "She's trapped." The sound of sobbing intensified, then abruptly cut off, leaving an even more unsettling silence in its wake. Martha Perkins began to circulate with her basket. Pie, freshly baked apple, and something special. Her smile was vacant, her eyes unfocused. Doc Ramsey, despite his earlier skepticism, accepted a slice. He sniffed it warily. "Smells all right," he muttered, taking a tentative bite. Odessa saw him chew, then his eyes widened slightly. He took another, larger bite, a strange, almost rapturous expression briefly crossing his features before he schooled it back to neutrality. A short, stout woman entered from the side exit Timmy had used. She had a severe hairstyle and wore a prim, dark dress. This, Odessa presumed, was Miss Evangeline Croft, proprietor of the Haven Inn. "Welcome, welcome," Miss Croft said, her voice surprisingly soft but carrying an unnerving intensity. "The rooms are ready. Such a pleasure to have new guests." She carried a large, leather-bound register and a long, dark quill pen that looked disturbingly like a sharpened bone. She began to solicit names from the remaining passengers, insisting they sign her book. One older gentleman, a Mr. Henderson, who had been complaining loudly about the train service, suddenly went quiet after signing. He looked around, a dazed expression on his face, then allowed Miss Croft to lead him away without a word of protest. His wife followed, wringing her hands, her earlier agitation replaced by a strange placidity. Odessa avoided Miss Croft's gaze. The air in the station was growing heavier, the charade of welcome wearing thin. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that Providence Station was not a sanctuary. It was a trap, and the doors were slowly closing. The weeping had stopped, but the silence it left behind was filled with an unspoken, looming dread. People were being separated, led away. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a creeping terror of the unknown. She needed to understand what this place was, before she, or Sammy, became another name in Miss Croft's sinister register. Chapter 4: Cracks in the Facade. The next few hours passed in a haze of unnerving calm and simmering anxiety. Most of the midnight excursion's passengers had been dispersed, either to the lounge for Martha Perkins' pies, or ushered away by Timmy and Miss Croft towards the Haven Inn or other unseen accommodations in the town. Odessa, feigning a sudden illness, had managed to avoid being herded with the others, finding a shadowed alcove behind a stack of forgotten luggage near the main hall's periphery. Sammy, sensing her unease, had quietly joined her, his small presence a strange comfort. Albin Ferrier, the old horologist, also lingered, his gaze constantly darting towards the station's grand, silent clock, as if expecting it to spring to malevolent life. "This place, it doesn't obey the rules," Ferrier muttered, more to himself than to Odessa. He tapped a finger against his own pocket watch. "My timepiece, a chronometer of utmost precision. It runs, then it stops, then it jumps. The mechanisms within the station clock are frozen, yet I swear I saw the minute hand twitch not 10 minutes past." Odessa nodded slowly. "The light, too, it hasn't changed. It's been hours since we arrived, but it's still that same perpetual twilight outside." "Precisely," Ferrier exclaimed, a flicker of scholarly excitement warring with his fear. "No discernible solar cycle. The gas lamps burn without consuming fuel, it seems. And the architecture," he gestured vaguely. "Some elements are pure Victorian Gothic, others possess a curious, almost unsettling fluidity in their lines, as if dreamt rather than built." Sammy, who had been quietly observing, tugged Odessa's sleeve. He presented a new drawing. This one was more complex. It showed the station, but the lines were distorted, bending at impossible angles. Stick figures representing passengers wandered through it, and some were being pulled into the walls by shadowy, elongated hands. In the center stood a larger stick figure, clearly Mr. Comstock, with a grotesquely wide smile, and from his back sprouted multiple, grasping tendrils. "He's the house," Sammy whispered, his eyes wide. "The house eats." Odessa studied the drawing, a cold dread coiling in her gut. The child's imagery was crude, yet powerfully evocative of the feeling the station induced, that of being inside a living, breathing trap. "What else do you see, Sammy?" Sammy pointed to a corner of his drawing where a small figure was crying, its tears watering strange, sharp-toothed flowers. "The sad lady in the wall. She warns people, but they don't listen." A faint sound reached them, a door creaking open and then closing from the direction Jessa and Kalen had been led. A few minutes later, Kalen appeared, his face ashen. He looked frantic, his eyes darting around the station hall. "Jessa," he choked out, spotting Odessa. "Have you seen Jessa?" "She went with you to the inn," Odessa said, rising. "What happened?" Kalen ran a hand through his hair, his movements jerky. "We got to the room. It was nice, old-fashioned but clean. Miss Croft offered us tea. Jessa was so tired she drank it. She fell asleep almost immediately. I stepped out for just a moment to try and find a working toilet. The one in the room was strange. The water was black, and when I came back, maybe 5 minutes later, she was gone." "Gone," Ferrier gasped. The bed was empty. Her bag was still there. The window was locked from the inside. "It's like she just vanished," Kalen said, his voice cracking. "I called for her. Miss Croft came. She just smiled, that awful smile, and said Jessa probably went for a walk to admire the town's beauty. But Jessa wouldn't do that, not without me, not like this." His gaze was desperate. "The mirror in the room. When I looked in it just before I left, I thought I saw." Her reflection was still there for a second after she turned away from it, and it was smiling differently. Odessa exchanged a look with Ferrier. Reflections, the weeper, Sammy's drawings, the pieces were forming a disturbing mosaic. "Kalen," Odessa began gently, "this place isn't what it seems. We need to be very careful." Before Kalen could reply, the sound of sobbing echoed through the station again, louder this time, more desperate. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the inn. Kalen tensed. "Jessa," he whispered, then, with a surge of adrenaline, he bolted towards the sound. "Kalen, wait," Odessa called, but he was already gone. "Foolish boy," Ferrier muttered. "He'll be walking right into its maw." The main doors of the station creaked open, and Mr. Comstock re-entered, still beaming. He was accompanied by Sheriff Brody, whose face remained impassive. "Everything to your liking, my friends," Comstock chirped, his gaze sweeping the hall. He seemed to notice the diminished number of remaining passengers. "Ah, many have already found comfort in Providence's embrace. Excellent, excellent." His eyes landed on Odessa, Sammy, and Ferrier. The smile faltered just for an instant. A flicker of something cold and assessing passed through his eyes before the joviality snapped back. "And you three? Still admiring the architecture, perhaps? Or are you ready for some of Martha's delightful pies?" "We're fine, Mr. Comstock," Odessa said, trying to keep her voice even. "Just taking it all in." "Taking it all in," Comstock repeated slowly, savoring the words. "Yes, Providence has much to be taken in, and much that it takes in return." He chuckled, a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate in Odessa's teeth. The cloying sweetness in the air intensified around him. Odessa noticed, for the first time, that the brass buttons on his uniform were not brass at all. They seemed to be made of a dull, chitinous material, like beetle shells, and the skin on his hands, though plump, had a slightly translucent quality, revealing a faint network of darker veins beneath. Sheriff Brody shifted his weight, his hand resting near the butt of an old, oversized pistol holstered at his hip. His gaze was fixed on Ferrier, who was visibly trembling. Suddenly a scream tore through the station, a raw, terrified sound unmistakably Kalen's. It was cut off abruptly. A silence. Comstock's smile didn't waver. Ah, the exuberance of youth, discovering new things, no doubt. Odessa felt sick. Sammy whimpered and buried his face in her side. Ferrier looked as if he might faint. The facade of Providence Station was cracking, revealing the monstrous reality beneath. The welcome was a lie, the comfort a trap, and whatever lurked within its walls, whatever ate, was now actively feeding. The time for passive observation was over. If they didn't act, they would be next. Odessa met Ferrier's terrified gaze. He nodded almost imperceptibly. The game had changed. Survival was the only objective now. Chapter 5: The Gardener's Offerings. The scream, followed by Comstock's chillingly nonchalant dismissal, hung in the air of Providence Station like a poisonous fog. Odessa's mind raced. Kalen was gone. Jessa was gone. How many others had been lured away by the station's inhabitants and their false promises? The town beyond the station, she suspected, was no town at all, but an extension of this elaborate, predatory illusion. "Mr. Comstock," Odessa said, her voice tight but controlled, "I think it's time you told us exactly what kind of respite Providence offers. And what happened to Kalen?" Comstock chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "Curiosity, Miss Vance, a commendable trait in a journalist, I suppose. Young Kalen was simply overcome by the unique atmosphere here. Some find it exhilarating, others a trifle overwhelming." He spread his hands. "Providence provides what each soul truly seeks, or perhaps what it truly deserves." The cloying sweetness around him seemed to pulse, and Odessa caught a fleeting glimpse of something dark and manifold shifting just beneath his skin, like a nest of worms beneath a thin layer of dough. She blinked, and it was gone. Or had it ever been there? Sheriff Brody took a slow step forward, his impassive face a mask. "Best you folks find yourselves a seat. Relax. Enjoy the hospitality." His hand strayed closer to his holstered weapon. Odessa knew they were being subtly corralled. "Sammy," she whispered, "stay close to Mr. Ferrier." Alban Ferrier, though pale, straightened his waistcoat with a show of defiance. "I demand to know the meaning of this. We are passengers on the midnight excursion, and we have rights." Comstock's smile became a thin line. "Rights," he said, his voice losing its jovial edge, becoming flat and cold. "Rights are a construct of a world you have, for all intents and purposes, left behind. Here in Providence there is only acceptance." Before Odessa could press further, a new figure entered the main hall from a side passage that presumably led towards the town. It was an old man, his back bent, his skin weathered like ancient leather. He wore simple, earth-stained overalls and carried a trug basket filled with an array of brightly colored, almost luminous fruits and flowers. This must be Jedediah, the gardener of edible horrors Sammy had depicted in his drawings. "Fresh pickings, station master," Jedediah croaked, his voice like rustling dry leaves. He offered the basket to Comstock. "The night orchids are particularly potent this eve." Comstock's eyes gleamed as he selected a deep purple, star-shaped flower. He inhaled its fragrance deeply. Exquisite, Jedediah, truly exquisite. He then turned his attention to Odessa, Ferrier, and Sammy. Perhaps our remaining guests would care for a sample, a taste of Providence's bounty. It can be illuminating. Jedediah shuffled closer, offering his basket. The fruits glowed with an inner light and the flowers seemed to writhe subtly. The aroma they exuded was intoxicating, a complex blend of honey, spice, and something else, something primal and unsettling. Sammy recoiled, pressing himself against Odessa. "No bad flowers." Odessa held up a hand. "Thank you, but we're not hungry." Jedediah's eyes, small and dark like beads, fixed on her. A slow, knowing smile spread across his wrinkled face, revealing surprisingly sharp, stained teeth. "Ah, but the hunger finds everyone in Providence, sooner or later. It's a special kind of hunger." Doc Ramsey, who had been sitting slumped on a bench after consuming Martha Perkins' pie, suddenly groaned. He clutched his stomach, his face contorted in pain. Then, just as quickly, the pain seemed to pass, replaced by a look of dazed euphoria. "More pie," he mumbled, his eyes unfocused. "Need more." He stumbled towards where Martha had last been seen. "You see," Comstock said softly, gesturing towards Ramsey. "Contentment, surrender, it is the Providence way." Odessa watched Ramsey's display with growing horror. The food, the flowers, they weren't just sustenance. They were tools of control, of alteration. She noticed two figures lurking near the station's main exit to the platform, the Glimmer Hounds. They appeared as large, shaggy dogs, but their fur had that unnatural, oily sheen she'd seen in Sammy's drawings, and their eyes glowed with a faint, predatory light. They weren't overtly threatening, but they were positioned strategically, blocking the most obvious escape route. "I believe it's time we were shown to our accommodations, Mr. Comstock," Odessa said, trying a different tack. If they were to find a way out, they needed to understand the layout of this place, and perhaps being accommodated was the only way to explore further without immediate confrontation. Comstock's smile returned full force. "An excellent decision, Miss Vance, prudent, Timmy." The overly eager bellhop materialized almost instantly, his grin wider than ever. "Yes, Station Master Comstock. Our esteemed guests require lodging. See them to the East Wing. Ensure they are comfortable." There was a subtle emphasis on the word comfortable that sent a chill down Odessa's spine. Timmy practically bounced on the balls of his feet. "Right this way, folks. The East Wing has splendid views of the town square." Odessa took Sammy's hand. Ferrier, looking reluctant but seeing no other option, fell in beside them. As Timmy led them away from the main hall down a long, dimly lit corridor, Odessa glanced back. Comstock and Jedediah were watching them, their expressions unreadable. Sheriff Brody had not moved, a silent, menacing sentinel. The corridor Timmy led them down was lined with closed doors. Faint sounds occasionally seeped from behind them, a low moan, a rustling sound, a snatch of discordant music. The cloying sweet smell was stronger here, mixed with an underlying metallic tang like old blood. "The East Wing is very popular," Timmy chirped, oblivious or indifferent to the unsettling atmosphere. "Very restful." He stopped before a heavy oak door at the end of the corridor. "Here we are, Suite 7, all yours." He produced an ornate iron key and unlocked the door, pushing it open with a flourish. The room beyond was large, furnished with heavy, dark antiques. A four-poster bed dominated the space, its curtains drawn. A single gas lamp cast flickering shadows on the flocked wallpaper, which depicted a repeating pattern of what looked like grasping hands. "If you need anything, anything at all," Timmy said, his grin unwavering, "just think it. Someone will attend you." He bowed slightly, then backed out of the room, pulling the door shut with a soft click. The sound of the key turning in the lock was unnervingly loud in the sudden silence. Odessa immediately tried the door. Locked. "So much for views of the town square," Ferrier muttered, peering through the grimy window. It looked out onto a brick wall no more than 3 feet away. Sammy, meanwhile, had been drawn to the four-poster bed. He reached out a small hand and slowly pulled back one of the heavy velvet curtains. Odessa turned, a warning on her lips, but it died in her throat. Lying on the bed, pale and still, was Jessa. Her eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the canopy above. She didn't breathe. She didn't move. But as they watched, a single, perfect tear, impossibly dark like ink, welled in the corner of her eye and traced a path down her cheek. And from the walls around them, faint at first, then growing in strength, came the sound of a woman weeping. The weeper in the walls was here in this room with its latest acquisition. The station wasn't just taking people. It was integrating them, making them part of its sorrowful, terrifying fabric. Chapter 6: The Unmasking. The sight of Jessa, so still, so utterly bereft of life yet shedding that single dark tear, froze Odessa and Ferrier to the spot. Sammy, however, let out a small, choked gasp and stumbled backwards, his eyes fixed on the weeping figure who was not quite Jessa anymore. The air in the room grew colder, the cloying sweetness mingling with an ancient, sorrowful dust. The weeping from the walls intensified, resonating with the silent grief on the bed. "Jessa," Ferrier whispered, his voice hoarse. He took a step forward, then recoiled as if struck. "Her eyes, they are not her own." Odessa forced herself to look closer. Jessa's eyes, usually a warm hazel, were now a flat, depthless black, reflecting the dim gaslight like polished obsidian. The tear that had escaped was followed by another, then another, each one staining the pristine white pillowcase with an unnatural darkness. "She's part of it now," Odessa breathed, a horrifying understanding dawning. "The weeper, this is how it claims them." Sammy, trembling, pointed to the wall behind the bed. "She's in there too. I can see her face. Sad." Odessa squinted. In the shifting shadows cast by the gas lamp, the patterned wallpaper seemed to writhe. For a fleeting moment she saw it, a ghostly, translucent face superimposed over the grasping hands, its features contorted in an expression of infinite sorrow. It was Jessa's face. A sudden, violent banging on the corridor door startled them. "Open up! Station master's orders!" It was Sheriff Brody's flat voice, but laced with an uncharacteristic urgency. Odessa exchanged a quick, fearful glance with Ferrier. There was no escape through the window, only the brick wall. The locked door was their only exit from this terrible room. "What do we do?" Ferrier hissed, his composure shattering. Odessa thought fast. Confrontation was inevitable. Perhaps, just perhaps, they could use it. "Stay behind me, both of you." She took a deep breath and walked to the door, turning the old iron key. The door swung inward to reveal Sheriff Brody, his face unusually flushed, his eyes darting nervously. Behind him stood Timmy the bellhop, his fixed grin looking more like a rictus of terror. "There's been a disturbance," Brody said, his voice strained. "Some of the newer arrivals. They're not settling well, causing a ruckus in the West Wing." "A ruckus," Odessa repeated, feigning ignorance. "What kind of ruckus?" Timmy wrung his hands, screaming, breaking things they don't understand, they won't accept. "The station master requires all available hands to restore order," Brody interrupted, his gaze sweeping past Odessa to the figure on the bed. He paused, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly before his expression hardened again. "You three, come with me. Now." This was unexpected, a problem elsewhere, a chance however slim. "And what about her?" Odessa asked, gesturing towards Jessa. Brody's eyes flickered to the bed again, then away. "She's found her place. She won't be going anywhere." The implication was chilling. Odessa knew this was a critical moment. To resist was to invite immediate, overwhelming force. To comply might offer an opportunity, a glimpse into the station's workings, a chance to find a weakness. "All right, Sheriff," Odessa said, trying to sound compliant. "We'll come." Sammy clung to her hand, his small body trembling. Ferrier, though visibly terrified, squared his shoulders. Brody grunted and turned, leading the way back down the corridor. Timmy scurried after him, casting fearful glances over his shoulder at Suite 7. As they walked, the sounds of chaos grew louder, shouts, crashes, a roar of incoherent rage that was barely human. The cloying sweetness in the air was now mixed with the acrid stench of something burning. They reached the main hall. It was in disarray. Several benches were overturned. Gas lamps had been smashed, plunging parts of the hall into deeper shadow. A group of what appeared to be station staff, figures in faded, nondescript uniforms, their faces blank and doughy, were struggling to subdue 2 or 3 of the midnight excursion's passengers. One was Doc Ramsey. The pie-induced euphoria had clearly worn off, replaced by a savage, desperate fury. He fought with surprising strength, lashing out, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "The food," he bellowed, his voice hoarse. "It changes you, makes you one of them." Another passenger, a burly man Odessa remembered seeing in the dining car, was smashing a chair against a pillar, screaming about being trapped. Mr. Comstock stood near the grand, silent clock, his usual joviality gone, replaced by a mask of cold fury. His portly frame seemed to quiver, and the illusion of his humanity was visibly thinning. His skin had taken on a waxy, translucent sheen, and his eyes glowed with a faint, internal luminescence. The buttons on his uniform strained, not against flesh, but against something that bulged and shifted beneath the fabric. "Incompetence," Comstock hissed, his voice a sibilant whisper that cut through the din. "Control them. Providence demands harmony." As he spoke, the shadows in the corners of the hall seemed to deepen, to coalesce. From them, new figures emerged, not human, not anymore. They were tall and gaunt, their limbs too long, their faces obscured by shadow, moving with an unnatural, silent grace. These were the pest control Sammy had drawn, the true enforcers of Providence Station. One of the shadowy figures glided towards Doc Ramsey. Ramsey, seeing it approach, let out a howl of terror and redoubled his struggles, but the doughy-faced staff held him fast. The figure reached out a long, skeletal hand, and a faint, dark mist seemed to flow from its fingertips towards Ramsey. The doctor went rigid, his eyes rolling back in his head, then slumped, unconscious or worse. The illusion of Providence Station was not just cracking, it was shattering. This was no haven. This was a processing plant, a farm, and the passengers were the crop. Odessa saw her chance in the chaos. Comstock was distracted. Brody was trying to direct the staff. The shadowy enforcers were focused on the rebellious passengers. "Now," she whispered to Ferrier and Sammy, "the main doors to the platform." Ferrier nodded, his face grim. Sammy clutched Odessa's hand tighter, his eyes wide but resolute. They began to edge away from the melee, towards the massive doors that led back to the train. But Timmy the bellhop, despite his earlier fear, noticed their movement. "Station master," Timmy shrieked, his voice cracking with panic, pointing a trembling finger. "They're trying to leave." Comstock's head snapped towards them. His face was no longer remotely human. The skin was stretched taut over sharp, angular bones, his mouth, a lipless gash filled with needle-like teeth. The jovial station master was gone, unmasked. In his place was a creature of pure, predatory hunger. "No one leaves Providence," it roared, its voice a chorus of discordant shrieks. Tendrils, dark and glistening, erupted from its back, lashing out like whips. The glimmer hounds, which had been lurking near the exit, snarled and bounded forward, their eyes blazing with malevolent light. Odessa shoved Sammy behind her. Ferrier, surprisingly, stepped forward, brandishing a heavy, ornate letter opener he must have picked up somewhere. "Get the boy out," he yelled. "I'll hold them." It was a futile gesture, but it bought them a precious second. Odessa didn't hesitate. She grabbed Sammy and sprinted for the doors, Ferrier's defiant shouts and the enraged howls of the hounds echoing behind her. One of Comstock's tendrils whipped past her head, close enough for her to feel its cold, slick passage. She reached the massive door handle, fumbling with it. It was heavy, stiff. Behind her she heard Ferrier cry out in pain, a sickening crunch. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, Odessa yanked the handle down. The door groaned open a few inches. She squeezed through, pulling Sammy with her, out onto the cold, gaslit platform where their nightmare had begun. The midnight excursion still stood there, a silent, dark sentinel. If they could just reach it. if it could just move. But Providence was not done with them yet. Chapter 7. The Terminus Heart. Out on the platform, the air felt marginally cleaner, free of the concentrated sweetness and decay that permeated the station house. But the sense of oppressive wrongness remained. The gas lamps cast long, dancing shadows, and the midnight excursion loomed, its windows dark and lifeless. There was no sign of an engineer, no flicker of power. "Mr. Ferrier," Sammy cried, looking back towards the station doors, his small face crumpled with distress. Odessa pulled him along. "We can't help him now, Sammy. We have to keep moving." Guilt gnawed at her, but Ferrier's sacrifice, however brief, could not be in vain. The howls of the Glimmer hounds grew louder from within the station. They would be out in moments. "The train," Odessa urged, dragging Sammy towards the nearest carriage. The door was closed and her heart sank. She rattled the handle, locked. She tried the next one, also locked. Panic began to set in. They were trapped on the platform with monsters at their back and an inert train before them. Then from the station house came a sound that chilled Odessa to the bone, a low, rhythmic chiming. It was the grand station clock, the one Albin Ferrier had declared broken for decades. It was striking the hour, each chime resonating not just in the air but deep within her chest, vibrating her very bones. With each chime, the reality of the platform seemed to shimmer, to become less solid. The edges of the gas lamps blurred, and the stone beneath her feet felt momentarily insubstantial, like walking on packed sand. "The clock," Odessa gasped, remembering Ferrier's obsession with it, Sammy's drawing of Comstock as the house. "It's controlling this place. The illusion." The Glimmer hounds burst from the station doors, their shadowy forms moving with terrifying speed, their eyes burning like malevolent coals. They were not dogs. They were something else entirely, their bodies shifting, their limbs bending at unnatural angles as they ran. "This way," Odessa cried, spotting a maintenance ladder leading up to the roof of a low shed adjoining the station. It was a desperate, foolish idea, but it was the only direction that wasn't immediately cut off. She pushed Sammy ahead of her. "Climb quickly." Sammy scrambled up the rungs with surprising agility. Odessa followed, her muscles screaming in protest, the hound snapping at her heels. She felt a searing pain as sharp teeth grazed her calf, but she kicked out blindly and hauled herself onto the shed's flat roof just as the first hound leaped, its jaws snapping shut inches below her foot. From their precarious vantage point, they could see into the main hall of the station through a high, grimy window. The scene within was hellish. Comstock, now fully transformed into a grotesque, multi-limbed entity, was directing the chaos. His tendrils lashed out, ensnaring struggling passengers. The shadowy enforcers moved with chilling efficiency, subduing anyone who resisted. The very walls of the station seemed to pulse and shift, the patterns in the wallpaper writhing like living things. The chiming of the clock stopped, and with its cessation a new horror began. The midnight excursion itself started to change. Its sleek, dark paint seemed to blister and peel, revealing a rusty, corrupted metal beneath. Tendrils like metallic vines snaked out from its undercarriage, anchoring it to the platform. The windows, once dark, now glowed with a faint, sickly green light, and behind them shadowy figures seemed to move. The train was not an escape. It was part of the trap, the station's grotesque appendage. "It's all connected," Odessa whispered, horrified. "The station, the train, Comstock, the clock. It's one giant organism." Sammy pointed a trembling finger towards the station's clock tower, visible above the main roofline. "The heart," he said, his voice barely audible. "The bad clock is the heart." Odessa understood. If they could stop the clock, truly stop it, perhaps they could break the illusion or at least disrupt it enough to find a real way out. But how could they reach it? Comstock, or whatever it was, would surely guard its core. Then a flicker of movement near the base of the clock tower caught her eye. A figure, small and agile, was scaling the ornate stonework. It was Kalen. He was alive. He moved with a desperate, almost feral intensity, clearly driven by a singular purpose. In his hand he clutched something metallic, a heavy wrench perhaps, or a length of pipe. "Kalen," Odessa breathed, a surge of hope, however faint, rising within her. He was heading for the clock face. The glimmer hounds below were trying to find a way onto the shed roof, clawing at the walls, their frustrated snarls echoing in the strange twilight. Odessa knew they didn't have much time. "Sammy," she said, her voice urgent, "we need to create a diversion, something to draw their attention away from Kalen." Sammy looked around wildly, his eyes falling on a pile of old, discarded crates and tarpaulins near the edge of the shed roof. "Fire," he suggested, his small face pale but determined. Odessa nodded. It was risky, but it might work. She fumbled in her pockets, her fingers closing around the small, cheap lighter she always carried for her infrequent cigarettes. Working together, they dragged a dry, dusty tarpaulin over to the edge of the roof closest to the station house. They piled flammable debris beneath it. With trembling hands, Odessa flicked the lighter. The flame caught, small at first, then greedily consuming the old canvas. Smoke began to billow, thick and acrid. The flames grew, casting an orange, flickering light that contrasted sharply with the steady gaslight glow. "Fire, fire!" Odessa yelled, pointing towards the station. The effect was immediate. Several of the doughy-faced staff within the station turned towards the commotion. Even Comstock's monstrous head swiveled, its multiple eyes focusing on the new threat. The glimmer hounds below paused in their attempts to reach the shed roof, their attention drawn by the smoke and flames. Kalen, meanwhile, had reached the clock face. He was a small silhouette against the luminous dial. He raised the object in his hand and began to smash it repeatedly against the glass. Shards rained down. He was attacking the clock's hands, the mechanism itself. Inside the station, Comstock let out an unearthly shriek of rage and pain. The very structure of the station seemed to groan. The lights flickered violently. The tendrils extending from the train writhed and retracted slightly. The diversion was working, but it was also drawing unwanted attention to their own position. One of the shadowy enforcers detached itself from the melee in the main hall and glided towards the shed, its movements unnervingly smooth. "We need to go," Odessa yelled, grabbing Sammy. "Now." She scanned the platform. The train was still a death trap. The station was impossible. But as the station groaned and shuddered under Kalen's assault on its heart, a section of the platform near the far end, previously solid stone, seemed to crack and splinter. A dark fissure appeared, widening with each blow Kalen landed on the clock. From it, a strange, cold wind blew, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, the scent of the real world they had left behind. It was a sliver of a chance, a momentary weakness in the fabric of this nightmare reality. There, Odessa pointed, if we can reach that fissure. The shadowy enforcer was at the base of the shed, its formless head tilted upwards. It began to flow up the wall like animate smoke. There was no time. Odessa made a decision. She scooped Sammy into her arms. "Hold on tight," she yelled, and with a desperate prayer, she leaped from the shed roof towards the far end of the platform, aiming for the growing crack in reality, the shrieks of Comstock and the howls of the hounds pursuing them like the voices of damnation itself. The ground rushed up to meet them, and then oblivion. The last thing Odessa heard before consciousness fled was the final, shattering crash from the clock tower, followed by a wave of utter, profound silence that swallowed Providence Station whole. Chapter 8: The Shattered Looking Glass. The impact was brutal, a jarring collision that stole Odessa's breath and sent stars exploding behind her eyelids. She'd twisted midair, trying to cushion Sammy with her own body, and her shoulder and hip took the brunt of the landing. For a moment, there was only a roaring in her ears and the coppery taste of blood in her mouth. She'd bitten her tongue. Then, agonizingly, awareness returned. She lay on something cold and uneven. Not the smooth, treacherous stone of the Providence Station platform, but rough, broken ground, littered with sharp rocks and what felt like splintered wood. The air was different, too. Gone was the cloying sweetness, the perpetual gaslight. Instead, a damp, earthy smell filled her nostrils, pine needles, wet soil, the clean scent of a coming storm. And it was dark, truly dark, the kind of moonless, star-obscured night that belonged to the deep wilderness. "Sammy," Odessa gasped, her voice a raw croak. She tightened her hold on the child, who was mercifully limp but breathing. He whimpered, a small, distressed sound. Slowly, painfully, Odessa pushed herself up to a sitting position. Her left arm throbbed and a sharp pain shot through her hip with every movement. Above them, where Providence Station and its hellish clock tower had loomed, there was now nothing, or rather something even more disturbing. The very air seemed to tear and ripple like a badly projected film. Shards of impossible geometry, a glimpse of a gas lamp flickering out, a section of ornate cornice crumbling into dust, a soundless scream from a face that was half Comstock, half shadow, flashed in and out of existence. The fissure they had aimed for was no longer a neat crack in the platform. It was a gaping, unstable wound in reality itself, through which they had apparently fallen. The sounds were a cacophony. The dying shriek of the station clock as Kalen delivered the final blows, the enraged howls of the glimmer hounds dissolving into static hisses, the chorus of tormented voices that had been Providence Station itself, fading into a discordant, guttural moan. It was as if a monstrous entity was thrashing in its death throes. Did we make it?" Sammy whispered, his voice trembling as he clung to Odessa. He coughed, dust filling his small lungs. "I think so, Sammy. I think Kalen did it," Odessa managed, her gaze fixed on the unraveling nightmare above. The light from the dissolving station cast fleeting, phantasmagorical patterns on the rough ground around them. It was like watching a city made of smoke being blown apart by a furious wind. A section of what looked like the station's roof detached itself, not falling but simply unmaking, its tiles turning to black motes that were then sucked into the roiling chaos. The massive, dark form of the midnight excursion shuddered violently, its corrupted metal skin flacking away, its sickly green window glow extinguishing one by one. The metallic tendrils that had anchored it to the false platform snapped and recoiled like dying serpents. Then, with a final, soul-wrenching groan that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them, the entire illusion of Providence Station imploded. The tearing, shimmering wound in reality sealed itself shut with a sound like a giant exhaling, leaving behind only the natural darkness of the night and the distant sigh of the wind through unseen trees. Silence, a profound, almost deafening silence, broken only by their own ragged breaths and the chirping of crickets, a sound so normal it was almost shocking. Odessa carefully helped Sammy to sit up. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head, though his face was pale and smudged with dirt. "My arm hurts a bit." He pointed to a scrape on his elbow. "We're lucky," Odessa said, though luck felt like a cruel joke after what they'd endured. Her own injuries were making themselves known with a vengeance. Her shoulder felt dislocated, and her leg was a riot of pain. She scanned their surroundings. They appeared to be in a shallow ravine or a dried-up creek bed. Steep, earthen banks rose on either side, topped with dense forest. The ground was uneven, treacherous. There was no sign of the railway tracks, no sign of anything familiar. "Kalen," Odessa said, her voice tight. "We have to find Kalen and the train, if it's still there." But where to even begin? The implosion of Providence had been disorienting, and their landing haphazard. Suddenly, Sammy pointed towards the top of the ravine's western bank. "Look." A faint, flickering light. Not the steady, malevolent glow of a gas lamp, but the unsteady orange of a small fire. And then, a figure silhouetted against it. Tall, haggard, but unmistakably human. "Kalen," Odessa called out, her voice hoarse. The figure turned. Even from this distance, she could see the exhaustion in his slump, the way he leaned heavily on something, the pipe or wrench he'd used on the clock. "Odessa, Sammy." His voice was raw, strained, but it was him. He started to stumble down the embankment towards them. Relief, sharp and overwhelming, washed over Odessa, momentarily eclipsing her pain. They weren't alone. Kalen reached them, his face grimy, his clothes torn. He had a nasty gash on his forehead and his hands were bloody. He knelt, pulling Sammy into a rough hug, then looked at Odessa, his eyes filled with a mixture of horror, grief, and disbelief. "Jessa," he choked out, "I saw her, in the room after the clock." Odessa nodded grimly. "We saw her too, she was part of it." Kalen's face crumpled. When the clock broke, the whole place just came apart, the figures, the station master. They screamed. They turned to dust or smoke. I just ran. I didn't know where I was going. He gestured back towards the small fire he'd managed to start. "I found some wreckage from something, wood, metal, but no sign of the main train. "What about the other passengers?" Odessa asked, dreading the answer. Kalen shook his head slowly. "I didn't see anyone else get out. When the station started to collapse, it was chaos. Things were just disappearing, people too. One minute they were there, the next, just empty space." He shuddered. "Doc Ramsey. I saw him. He was fighting one of those shadow things. Then the wall behind him just opened up like a mouth and swallowed him." The image was horrifying. Providence hadn't just killed its victims, it had consumed them, erased them. "Farrier?" Odessa asked quietly. Kalen's expression darkened. "He tried to stop those dog creatures. They got him. I saw it just before I reached the tower." He swallowed hard. "He saved us." Odessa closed her eyes for a moment, a silent acknowledgement of the old horologist's sacrifice. "We need to get out of this ravine," she said, trying to push past the pain and focus. "And find shelter. It's going to rain soon." The air was heavy with humidity, and a low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. With Kalen's help, though he was barely steady himself, Odessa managed to get to her feet. Every movement sent jolts of agony through her body. Sammy, despite his own fear and minor injuries, tried to support her other side. They slowly, painstakingly, made their way up the embankment towards Kalen's small fire. The ground was littered with debris, but it wasn't from the midnight excursion. It was older, rotted wood, twisted pieces of unrecognizable metal, chunks of weathered stone that looked like they might have come from an ancient ruin, not a Victorian station. It was as if the dead zone, or whatever entity controlled it, had been depositing its failed experiments or the remnants of its meals here for a very long time. As they reached the top, Kalen pointed. "Over there, I think I saw something." Through the trees, perhaps 50 yards away, was a dark, hulking shape. It was barely visible in the gloom, but as lightning briefly illuminated the landscape, Odessa recognized it. A train carriage. Not the pristine luxury of the midnight excursion as they had known it, but a single, battered, rust-streaked railway car, half derailed, canted at an unnatural angle, its windows smashed. It looked like it had been sitting there, abandoned for decades. But it was shelter, and perhaps, just perhaps, it held some answers or at least a temporary respite from the horrors of the dead zone that had spawned, and then consumed, Providence Station. The looking glass had shattered, but they were still trapped in its malevolent, unpredictable frame. Chapter 9. Echoes in a Rusted Shell. The lone railway carriage was a sorry sight. Its paint, once perhaps a proud crimson or a deep forest green, was now a patchwork of rust and faded, peeling layers. Several windows were jagged holes, others webbed with cracks. One set of wheels was buried deep in the soft earth, the other lifted awkwardly off a non-existent track, giving the whole structure a drunken, lopsided tilt. It looked less like a recent derailment and more like a forgotten relic, slowly being reclaimed by the encroaching forest. "Careful," Kalen warned, his voice low as they approached. "Could be anything in there." He still held the heavy pipe he'd used on the station clock, now more a weapon than a tool. Odessa nodded, her senses on high alert despite the throbbing pain that radiated from her shoulder and hip. The air around the carriage was still, heavy with the scent of decay and damp metal. There was no sign of recent human activity, no footprints in the soft earth leading to its doors. The nearest door hung ajar, creaking faintly with a gust of wind that rustled the leaves overhead. Kalen pushed it open further, peering into the gloom. Odessa held Sammy close, her heart pounding. After Providence Station, even an empty, derelict train car felt pregnant with potential menace. "Looks empty," Kalen finally said, stepping cautiously inside. Odessa followed, helping Sammy over the high, awkward step. The interior was a ruin. Seats were slashed, their stuffing spilling out like grotesque entrails. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, sodden papers, and a thick layer of dust and grime that suggested long abandonment. A faint, musty odor, overlaid with the metallic tang of rust, filled the air. It was a far cry from the opulent carriages of the midnight excursion, yet it was undeniably one of its kind, or perhaps one of its ancestors. "This can't be our train," Odessa murmured, running a hand over a torn velvet seat that still retained a hint of its former richness. "Or if it is, it's been here a very long time." Kalen found an old, dented lamp affixed to the wall. He fumbled with it, and to their surprise, a weak, yellowish light flickered on, powered by some unseen, dying source. It cast long, eerie shadows, making the derelict carriage seem even more desolate. "There's something like a battery compartment under the floorboards here," Kalen said, pointing. "Almost drained, but still a trickle." In the weak light they could see more details. Luggage racks were bent and empty. Curtains were shredded tatters. But in one corner, a small, leather-bound valise lay as if recently dropped, its brass clasp still gleaming faintly. Odessa moved towards it, her journalist's curiosity piqued despite her exhaustion. She unfastened the clasps. Inside, nestled on faded silk lining, were a few items: a silver-backed hairbrush, a small, velvet-covered poetry book, and a handful of sepia-toned photographs. The photographs depicted men and women in late Victorian or early Edwardian attire, posing stiffly. One showed a group standing on a station platform, remarkably similar in architecture to Providence, but clearly a different, perhaps earlier, iteration. The name on the station sign in the photograph was too faded to read. "Look at this," Odessa said, holding up the photo. Kalen peered at it. "It's like Providence, but not. What does this mean?" Before Odessa could answer, Sammy, who had been quietly exploring the far end of the carriage, let out a small gasp. "There's writing." He pointed to a section of the carriage wall where the grime was thinner. Scratched into the metal, crude but legible, were names and dates. Eleanor Vance, 1898. Thomas Ashton, 1923. The Miller Family, 1957, God Help Us. And then, chillingly, near the bottom, much fresher than the others: Jonathan Pike, conductor, last entry. The serpent sleeps, but it dreams of us. The station always calls us back. Odessa felt a cold dread grip her. Jonathan Pike, the conductor of their train, the midnight excursion. His voice from the intercom, smooth and practiced, then strained and terrified. His name, scratched here among these ghosts of journeys past. "He was here," Kalen breathed. "Our conductor, he knew about this place." "It seems this dead zone," Odessa said slowly, "has been claiming trains and their passengers for a very long time. Providence Station. It wasn't a one-time anomaly. It's a recurring nightmare, a trap that resets itself, adapts." The poetry book from the valise. Odessa picked it up. The title was Whispers from the Veil. She opened it to a random page. A single verse was circled. "Beyond the fields we know, the rails extend to where the world unravels and journeys end. A silent station waits, with gaslights gleam, to catch the unwary soul within its dream." A shiver traced its way down Odessa's spine. This wasn't just a collection of poems. It was a warning, a testament from a previous victim. Perhaps the Eleanor Vance whose name was scratched on the wall. Was she an ancestor? The shared surname felt like a cold hand clutching her heart. The weak lamp flickered, threatening to die. Rain began to patter against the carriage roof, quickly escalating into a downpour. The wind howled outside, rattling the broken windows. "We should try to rest," Kalen said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We're no good to anyone exhausted." They found a section of seats that was relatively intact, brushing away the worst of the dust and debris. Sammy, worn out by fear and exhaustion, curled up between them and was asleep almost instantly, his small face still etched with worry. Odessa and Kalen sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. The rhythmic drumming of rain on the rusted roof was a strangely comforting sound after the unnatural silence, and then the cacophony of Providence Station. Do you think it's really over?" Kalen asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Providence, I mean, come stock." Odessa thought of the tearing, imploding reality, Kalen's assault on the clock. "I think we broke that version of it, but the names on that wall, they suggest it comes back, or something like it does. This dead zone, whatever it is, it's the source." Kalen shuddered. "So we're not really free." "We're out of the station," Odessa said, trying to inject a note of hope she didn't entirely feel. "That's more than most, judging by this carriage." She looked at her own throbbing shoulder. "We need to find our way out of these woods, get to a real town, real help." The lamp flickered again, then died, plunging them into near-total darkness, broken only by the occasional distant flash of lightning that illuminated the desolate interior of their rusted shelter. Odessa leaned her head back against the grimy seat. Sleep felt impossible. Every shadow seemed to writhe. Every creak of the old carriage sounded like a footstep. The echoes of Providence were all around them, in the names scratched on the wall, in the items left behind by souls long lost. They had escaped the station, but the station, in a way, had come with them, its tendrils reaching into their minds, its memory a festering wound. Suddenly, amidst the drumming of the rain, Odessa heard another sound, faint at first, then clearer. A rhythmic clatter, steel on steel. Her blood ran cold. Kalen sat bolt upright, his head snapping towards the direction of the sound. It was distant but unmistakable, the sound of a train moving through the night, through the storm. And it was getting closer. Chapter 10. The Lingering Scent of Decay. The rhythmic clatter, an unwelcome ghost of their journey, grew steadily louder, cutting through the roar of the storm. Odessa and Kaelin exchanged terrified glances in the darkness of the derelict carriage. Sammy stirred in his sleep, whimpering softly. "It can't be," Kaelin whispered, his voice strained. "The midnight excursion. It was part of the station. It fell apart with it." "Maybe it's not our train," Odessa said, her mind racing. "Maybe it's another one. Another victim, another cog in the horrifying machine of the dead zone. Or worse, maybe it was Providence, reformed, hunting them." The names scratched on the carriage wall were a testament to the cyclical nature of this horror. The sound was much closer now, accompanied by the mournful, drawn-out wail of a train horn, a sound that should have signified civilization. But here, in this forsaken wilderness, it was a harbinger of dread. "We have to see," Odessa said, her resolve hardening despite the fear that clawed at her. "We can't just wait here for it to find us." Kaelin nodded, his face grim. He helped Odessa to her feet, her injured shoulder and hip screaming in protest. She gritted her teeth against the pain. They moved to one of the broken windows, peering out into the storm-lashed darkness. The rain was relentless, visibility almost zero. But then, through a momentary thinning of the downpour, they saw it. Lights, not the soft, steady glow of Providence's gas lamps, nor the sickly green of the corrupted midnight excursion. These were brighter, harsher, the powerful headlamps of a modern locomotive, slicing through the night, and behind them the illuminated windows of passenger cars. The train was moving fast, on tracks that seemingly hadn't existed moments before, tracks that now ran parallel to the ravine, not 50 yards from their rusted shelter. It wasn't slowing. It wasn't stopping. "It's a normal train," Kaelin breathed, disbelief warring with a desperate hope in his voice. "A real train." Could it be? Could they have stumbled, not just out of Providence, but back into the real world, or at least a place where real trains ran? As the locomotive thundered past, its horn blared again, a deafening blast that made them flinch. In the fleeting light from its windows, Odessa caught glimpses of passengers inside, blurred figures reading, talking, some even sleeping. It looked ordinary, impossibly, wonderfully ordinary. The last carriage, an observation car with wide windows, swept past. And for a split second, standing by one of those windows, looking out into the storm, Odessa saw a figure, a portly man in a dark uniform. His face was turned away, but there was something about his posture, his build. Her heart lurched. "Comstock," she choked out. Kaelin stared at her. "What? No, it couldn't be. He disintegrated." "I saw him, Kaelin, or someone who looked just like him, in the last car." Was her mind playing tricks? Was the trauma of Providence projecting its horrors onto the mundane? The train receded into the darkness, its clatter fading, leaving behind only the sound of the storm and a profound, unsettling silence. The phantom tracks it had run on seemed to vanish with it, as if they had never been. "It doesn't make sense," Kaelin said, shaking his head. "If that was a real train, why didn't it see us? Why didn't it stop?" "And if it wasn't real," Odessa countered, "what was it? A new illusion, a warning?" The brief spark of hope ignited by the train's appearance guttered and died, replaced by a deeper, more insidious fear. They weren't just lost in the wilderness. They were adrift in a place where reality itself was mutable, where the lines between what was real and what was a construct of the dead zone were terrifyingly blurred. Sammy woke up, startled by their tense whispers. "Is the bad train gone?" he asked, his voice small. Odessa gently stroked his hair. "Yes, sweetie, it's gone." She didn't have the heart to tell him about the figure she thought she'd seen, or the new layer of uncertainty that had settled over them. The storm began to subside as dawn approached, the rain softening to a drizzle. A pale gray light seeped into the rusted carriage, revealing their haggard faces, their torn and dirty clothes. Exhaustion was a heavy cloak on all of them. "We need to move," Odessa said, her voice flat. "Sitting here, we're just waiting for whatever comes next." Her injuries ached, but the urgency to escape this place overrode the pain. "We need to find a road, a landmark, anything." They salvaged what they could from the derelict carriage. Kalen found a half-empty, rust-stained canteen of water that tasted faintly of metal but was better than nothing. Odessa took the old poetry book and the photographs from the valise, grim mementos perhaps, but also a record, a warning. Sammy, surprisingly, found a small, tarnished silver locket under one of the seats, its chain broken. He clutched it tightly. As they stepped out of the carriage into the damp, gray morning, the forest seemed to press in on them, silent and watchful. The air, though fresh with the aftermath of the storm, still carried a faint, almost imperceptible undertone, the lingering scent of cloying sweetness, of decay, the scent of Providence. It was a ghost on the wind, a reminder that even though the station had fallen, its essence, its creator, was still out there, in the fabric of this twisted reality. They chose a direction west, towards where they thought the real world might lie, away from the site of Providence's implosion, and began to walk. Each step was an effort for Odessa, but she pushed on, driven by a desperate need to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the horrors they had witnessed. The forest was dense, the undergrowth thick. There were no paths, no signs of civilization. Hours passed. The sun, a pale disk behind the clouds, climbed higher. They stopped briefly to share the stale water. Sammy, despite his fear, was remarkably resilient, trudging along without complaint. Kalen, his face set in a grim mask, took the lead, using his pipe to clear away branches. Late in the afternoon, as despair began to set in, Kalen stopped. "Listen." Odessa strained her ears, at first nothing. Then faintly a sound, not a train this time. The distant, rhythmic barking of a dog, a real dog. And then another sound, even more welcome, the low rumble of an engine. Hope, fragile but tenacious, surged through Odessa. They pushed forward, their pace quickening despite their exhaustion and injuries. The sounds grew louder. They broke through a final line of trees and found themselves standing on the muddy shoulder of a narrow, unpaved logging road. And lumbering towards them, not 50 yards away, was an old, battered pickup truck. A man was driving, his weathered face peering at them with surprise through the rain-streaked windshield. He pulled to a stop beside them. "Well now," the man said, his voice a gravelly baritone, "you folks look like you've seen a bear and then some. Lost." Odessa could have wept. A real person, a real vehicle. Yes, she managed, her voice choked with emotion. Yes, we are very, very lost. The man, who introduced himself as Earl, a local trapper, regarded them with a mixture of concern and suspicion, his gaze lingering on their torn clothes and Odessa's obvious injuries. "Get in," he said finally, gesturing to the truck bed. "Ain't got room in the cab for all three, but I can take you to Pine Ridge. It's a small town, but they got a clinic, a phone." Pine Ridge, a real town. It sounded like paradise. As Earl helped them into the back of the truck, Odessa felt a wave of lightheadedness. The ordeal was over. Could it be that simple? But as the truck rumbled down the muddy road, away from the oppressive silence of the dead zone forest, Odessa couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The lingering scent of decay seemed to cling to her clothes, to her skin. The memory of the portly man in the observation car of the phantom train haunted her. Providence Station was gone, shattered like a dark mirror. But the entities that had built it, the forces that warped reality in this forgotten corner of the world, were they truly defeated? Or had they merely retreated, waiting to rebuild, to lure new victims into their ever-shifting, ever-hungry trap? The road to Pine Ridge was rough, and with every jolt, pain shot through Odessa's body. But it was a real pain, a pain of the real world. And for now, that was enough. Or perhaps, she thought with a chilling premonition, it was just another, more subtle, corridor in a much larger, inescapable maze. Chapter 11. The Scars of Pine Ridge. The journey to Pine Ridge in the back of Earl's rattling pickup truck was an agonizing blur for Odessa. Every bump in the rutted logging road sent fresh waves of pain through her injured shoulder and hip. She huddled with Sammy, trying to shield him from the worst of the jolts, while Kalen sat grim-faced, his gaze sweeping the dense tree line as if expecting some new horror to emerge from the shadows. The forest here looked normal, yet after Providence, every rustle of leaves, every flicker of movement in the periphery felt like a potential threat. Earl the Trapper was a man of few words. He'd given them a thick woolen blanket from behind his seat, which they gratefully shared. The air was turning colder as evening approached. After what felt like an eternity, the trees began to thin, and signs of civilization, however rustic, appeared. A dilapidated fence line, a weathered no trespassing sign riddled with buckshot, then a cluster of mailboxes at a fork in the road. Finally, the truck rumbled onto a paved, albeit cracked, asphalt surface. They passed a small, white-steepled church, its paint peeling, then a row of modest houses with darkened windows. This was Pine Ridge. It was less a town and more a scattering of buildings clinging to the edge of the vast wilderness they had just escaped. A single string of dim streetlights illuminated a short main street, revealing a general store with a faded Pepsi sign, a boarded-up diner, and a building with a crudely painted sign. Pineridge Clinic Doc Gable. Earl pulled up in front of the clinic. "This is it," he said, his gravelly voice betraying a hint of sympathy as he took in their battered state. "Doc Gable ain't a miracle worker, but he's good with stitches and setting bones. Tell him Earl sent you." "Thank you," Odessa said, her voice hoarse with gratitude that felt immense. We don't know how to repay you." Earl just grunted. Get yourselves seen to, and maybe stay out of those deep woods. Some places ain't meant for wandering. He gave them a long, appraising look, then climbed back into his truck and drove off, the sound of its laboring engine fading into the quiet evening. The clinic door was unlocked. Inside, a bare bulb illuminated a small, cluttered waiting room with a few mismatched chairs and a strong smell of antiseptic. An elderly man in a slightly stained white coat emerged from a back room, peering at them over spectacles perched on the end of his nose. This was presumably Doc Gable. Earl called ahead, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. Said he found some folks in a bad way. Looks like he wasn't exaggerating. His gaze, though kind, was also sharp, assessing. Come on back. Let's see what we're dealing with. The next few hours were a painful but necessary ordeal. Doc Gable, despite his rustic clinic, was competent and thorough. He confirmed Odessa's shoulder was dislocated and managed to reset it with a sickening crunch that made her cry out despite herself. Her hip was badly bruised, not broken, but would take time to heal. He cleaned and bandaged her gashed calf, which was already showing signs of infection from the Glimmer Hound's bite. Kalen's head wound required stitches, and his hands were a mess of cuts and abrasions. Sammy, thankfully, had only minor scrapes and bruises, but Doc Gable insisted on checking him thoroughly, clucking sympathetically at the child's quiet fear. You folks run into something fierce out there, Doc Gable remarked, expertly winding a bandage around Odessa's arm. Bobcat, or maybe a bear got ornery. Odessa, Kalen, and Sammy exchanged a quick, silent glance. How could they possibly explain Providence Station, Mr. Comstock, the weeper in the walls, the Glimmer Hounds? They would sound insane. Something like that, Kalen said vaguely. We got lost hiking, our gear was scattered. Doc Gable didn't press, but his eyes held a knowing look that made Odessa uneasy. It was the look of someone who had heard strange tales from the deep woods before, tales that defied easy explanation. Pine Ridge doesn't get many hikers this far out, he said mildly, especially not ones dressed like you were heading for a fancy dinner party. He gestured to their torn, once expensive clothes, relics of the midnight excursion. It was a last-minute trip, Odessa improvised lamely. Once they were patched up as best as possible, Doc Gable gave Odessa some painkillers and an old, worn wooden crutch. Sheriff's office is next to the general store, he said. Sheriff Brody, no relation to the one you might be thinking of, I reckon, can help you contact folks, report yourselves missing, that sort of thing. There's a guest house at the end of Main Street. Mrs. Henderson runs it. Clean beds, decent breakfast. You'll need a place to stay. The names Brody, Henderson sent a fresh chill through Odessa, despite the doctor's reassurances. Coincidences? Or were the tendrils of Providence, of the dead zone, longer and more insidious than she imagined? Mrs. Henderson's guest house was a large, slightly rambling Victorian house, surprisingly well-maintained compared to the rest of Pine Ridge. Martha Henderson, a woman with kind eyes and flour dusting her apron, welcomed them with a warm smile that seemed genuine, a stark contrast to the fixed grins of Providence. She listened to their heavily edited story of getting lost with sympathetic nods and tuts, then showed them to two adjoining rooms that were clean, smelled faintly of lavender, and most importantly, felt blessedly normal. Sammy, exhausted and finally feeling safe, fell asleep almost as soon as his head hit the pillow in the room he shared with Kaelin. Odessa, despite her own bone-deep weariness and the painkillers Doc Gable had given her, found sleep elusive. Every creak of the old house, every shadow in the corner of her room, resurrected the horrors of Providence. The rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway downstairs was a particularly cruel torment, each tick a reminder of the station's malevolent heart. She clutched the old poetry book she'd taken from the derelict carriage, its worn leather cover a strange comfort. Eleanor Vance, 1898, she whispered, tracing the name on the flyleaf. Was there a connection? A familial curse tied to this place, to these woods? The next morning, after a surprisingly good breakfast of pancakes and strong coffee, they walked to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody of Pine Ridge was a young, earnest man, nothing like the flat-voiced automaton of Providence Station. He listened patiently to their story, took down their names, and promised to contact the authorities in the nearest city to report them found. The midnight excursion. Sheriff Brody frowned when they mentioned the train. Can't say I've heard of that one running these routes. Most of the lines through the Monashee wilderness were shut down years ago. Too remote, too costly to maintain. This was deeply unsettling. If their train wasn't a recognized service, what had it been? A ghost train even before it entered the dead zone? Or was this another layer of the unreality, where the world they thought they knew was subtly, terrifyingly different? There was an incident a while back, the sheriff continued, consulting some notes. Small charter train went missing up in the Northern Territories. Never found a trace, but that was months ago. Different company altogether. Odessa felt a prickle of unease. Do you get many people lost in those woods? Sheriff Brody leaned back in his chair. More than you'd think. It's wild country, easy to get turned around. Some folks wander out after a few days, spooked but all right. Others, he trailed off, his expression somber. Others we never find. He looked at them pointedly. You three were lucky Earl found you, real lucky. As they left the sheriff's office, the fragile sense of normalcy Odessa had clung to began to fray. Pine Ridge, with its kind doctor, its welcoming guesthouse owner, its earnest sheriff, felt real. Yet the undercurrents were there, the abandoned diner, the hushed tones when speaking of the deep woods, the names that echoed their nightmare. They walked past the general store. In its dusty window, among displays of fishing lures and canned goods, was a rack of local newspapers. The headline of the top one, dated a week prior, read, "Another hiker missing in Monashe wilderness, search called off." Odessa picked up a copy. The missing hiker was a young woman, an artist who had gone into the woods seeking inspiration. Her photograph, a smiling, hopeful face, stared out from the page. Kaelin came up beside her, reading over her shoulder. His face paled. "She looks a bit like Jessa," he whispered, his voice tight with grief. Odessa felt a wave of nausea. The dead zone wasn't just claiming trains. It was a constant, insidious presence, preying on the unwary, its tendrils reaching even into seemingly normal towns like Pine Ridge. Later that day, as Sammy napped, Odessa found herself drawn to the small, white-steepled church they had passed on their way into town. Its door was unlocked. Inside, it was cool and quiet, smelling of old wood and hymn books. Stained glass windows cast muted colors on the worn wooden pews. At the back of the church, there was a memorial plaque. It listed names of Pine Ridge residents lost over the years, to accidents, to illness, to the unforgiving wilderness. Her breath caught in her throat. Among the names engraved in brass were Abigail Perkins, D. 1932, Jedediah Croft, D. 1907, Timothy Comstock, D. 1945. Perkins, Croft, Comstock, the baker, the innkeeper, the station master, not just similar names, the same names as the entities from Providence Station. The scars of Providence were not just on their bodies and in their minds. They were etched into the very history of this place, this town that sat on the precipice of an enduring, patient horror. Pine Ridge was not an escape. It was, perhaps, just another waiting room. And the dead zone was always calling its residents, old and new, back home. Chapter 12. The Unseen Rails. The discovery of the names on the church memorial plaque hit Odessa like a physical blow. Perkins, Croft, Comstock. The kindly Mrs. Henderson who ran the guest house, the earnest Sheriff Brody, even Doc Gable, were their names also echoes, placeholders in a recurring nightmare? Was Pine Ridge itself another, more subtle facade, a quieter, slower version of Providence Station's voracious trap? She stumbled out of the church, her mind reeling. The quiet normalcy of Pine Ridge now seemed like a thin veneer stretched taut over a monstrous reality. The townsfolk they had met, were they truly who they appeared to be? Or were they, too, part of the dead zone's elaborate, patient game? Perhaps they were descendants, their lives unknowingly intertwined with the entities that haunted the wilderness, their very identities subtly shaped by the proximity of the unhealing wound in the world. Kaylin found her sitting on a bench outside the general store, staring blankly at the dusty street. Sammy was listlessly kicking at a loose stone. "What's wrong?" Kaylin asked, seeing the look on her face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," Odessa said, her voice hollow. She told him about the names on the plaque. Kaylin listened, his expression growing increasingly grim. So the entities in Providence, they were based on real people, people from here. Or perhaps, Odessa countered, a chilling thought taking root, the people here are echoes of the entities, or replacements. What if the dead zone doesn't just create illusions but slowly corrupts and replaces the real, twisting communities over generations until they become part of its cycle? The thought was horrifying. It implied that even if they physically escaped the geographical confines of the dead zone, its influence, its patterns might replicate, follow them, insidiously weave themselves into the fabric of any new reality they tried to build. "We need to leave Pine Ridge," Kaylin said, his voice urgent. "Now. The sheriff said there's a bus that comes through once a day, heads south to a bigger city. We need to be on it." Odessa agreed. Pine Ridge, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a cage closing in. They spent the rest of the day in a state of heightened anxiety, packing the few belongings they had acquired, constantly looking over their shoulders. Mrs. Henderson, the guest house owner, remained friendly and solicitous, but Odessa couldn't shake the image of Martha Perkins from Providence, offering her poisoned pies with a vacant smile. Was Mrs. Henderson's kindness genuine, or a more refined form of lure? The bus was due in the late afternoon. They waited at the designated stop, a weathered wooden bench outside the general store, their meager bags at their feet. The few Pine Ridge residents who passed by offered brief, noncommittal nods. There was an insular quality to the town, a sense of secrets kept, of things unspoken. Odessa watched Sammy. The boy was quiet, withdrawn, clutching the tarnished silver locket he'd found in the derelict carriage. He hadn't drawn anything since they'd escaped Providence. It was as if the horrors had overwhelmed his ability to process them, even through his art. Finally, the bus appeared, a dusty, aging vehicle that wheezed to a stop. There were only a few other passengers on board, their faces tired and indifferent. With a profound sense of relief, Odessa, Kalen, and Sammy climbed aboard, settling into seats near the back. As the bus pulled away from Pine Ridge, Odessa looked out the window, half expecting to see Mr. Comstock waving goodbye from the steps of the general store, or the Glimmer hounds loping alongside the road. But there was only the receding image of the small, quiet town, its secrets hidden behind closed doors and watchful windows. The journey south was long and uneventful, a blessed monotony after the terrors they had endured. They passed through other small towns, each one looking more normal, more connected to the outside world than the last. The further they got from the Monashee wilderness, the more Odessa felt the oppressive weight of the dead zone begin to lift, though its psychological scars remained, deep and raw. They reached a small city by nightfall, a place with traffic lights, chain restaurants, and the anonymous bustle of ordinary life. It felt like another planet. Kalen used the money Earl had given them, a surprisingly generous amount, to get them a room in a nondescript motel. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Odessa allowed herself to truly relax. She took a long, hot shower, washing away the grime and, she hoped, some of the lingering taint of Providence. Sammy, after a fast food dinner that he devoured with an almost desperate hunger, fell into a deep, dreamless sleep in one of the motel beds. Odessa and Kalen sat up late talking in hushed tones. They had to decide what to do next. Go to the authorities with their unbelievable story. Try to forget and build new lives. But how could they forget? Providence Station was seared into their memories, its horrors a permanent part of who they now were. "I need to know more," Odessa said, her journalist's instincts, long suppressed by fear, reasserting themselves. Eleanor Vance, the name in the poetry book, the name on the carriage wall. If she was my ancestor, if she went through something like this, I have to understand. Kalen looked at her, his eyes filled with concern. "Odessa, are you sure? Digging into this, it could be dangerous. What if it draws their attention back to us?" "They already know about us, Kalen," Odessa said grimly. "The figure on that phantom train, the names in Pine Ridge. This isn't over, and I can't just run from it, not anymore." The next day, Odessa used the motel's spotty Wi-Fi to begin her research. She started with her own family history, a subject she had never paid much attention to. With a few lucky breaks, tracing back through census records and online genealogical databases, she found her. Eleanor Vance, born 1875, died 1898, cause of death, lost in a railway accident, Monashee Territory, body never recovered. A railway accident. The same year her name was scratched into the wall of that derelict carriage. The poetry book, Whispers from the Vale, had been published posthumously by her grieving family. Odessa felt a profound connection to this long-lost ancestor, a woman who had faced the same nightmare a century before. Eleanor hadn't survived, but she had left warnings, echoes in time. Digging deeper, Odessa found obscure historical accounts of strange disappearances in the Monashee region, dating back to the earliest days of railway construction. Tales of work crews vanishing, of trains entering remote tunnels and never emerging, of travelers reporting bizarre atmospheric phenomena and unsettling encounters. Most were dismissed as folklore, a product of isolation and hardship. But Odessa now knew better. These weren't just stories. They were fragmented pieces of a much larger, much more terrifying truth. The dead zone wasn't just a place. It was an entity, ancient and patient, feeding on the unwary, its influence spreading like a cancer along the unseen rails that connected its various manifestations. Providence Station was just one face of this multifaceted horror. One evening, while Kaylin and Sammy were out getting food, Odessa found an old, digitized map of the Monashee railway lines from the late 19th century. She traced the routes, her finger hovering over the remote, now abandoned sections. And then she saw it, a tiny, almost forgotten spur line, branching off into an area marked only as unsurveyed territory. The line seemed to end abruptly, in the middle of nowhere. Or did it? Using the archaic coordinates and comparing them to modern satellite imagery, she zoomed in. There was nothing there, just dense forest. But as she manipulated the image, playing with contrast and light filters, a faint, almost imperceptible pattern began to emerge in the landscape. Straight lines, too regular to be natural, hidden beneath the canopy. The ghostly outline of an old rail bed, overgrown and forgotten. And at the end of that phantom line, in a small, secluded valley, a faint circular anomaly in the trees. Too regular, too perfect. Like the foundation of a massive, round structure. Like a railway turntable, or the base of a colossal clock tower. The true heart of the dead zone, the place where Providence Station in all its guises was born and reborn. A cold dread mixed with a terrible, compelling curiosity gripped Odessa. She had to go there. She had to see it, to understand the source of this enduring nightmare. She knew it was madness. She knew it could mean her death. But the alternative, to live forever looking over her shoulder, haunted by the ghosts of Providence and the unanswered questions, was a different kind of death. When Kaylin and Sammy returned, Odessa showed them what she had found. "You can't be serious, Odessa," Kaylin said, his face pale. "Going back there, after everything we've been through." "I have to," Odessa said, her voice resolute. "Eleanor tried to warn people. Maybe I can do more. Maybe I can find a way to stop it for good." Sammy, who had been listening quietly, came over to Odessa and slipped his small hand into hers. He held up the tarnished silver locket he'd been clutching. He managed to pry it open. Inside, instead of a miniature portrait, was a tiny, intricately folded piece of paper. Odessa carefully unfolded it. It was a miniature hand-drawn map, crude, childlike, but undeniably a map. It showed a winding path through a forest, leading to a circle with a strange, spidery symbol in its center, a symbol that looked disturbingly like a multi-limbed creature with a too-wide smile. The symbol of Comstock. "The bad place," Sammy whispered. "The locket showed me where it really lives." The dead zone was calling them back. Not with illusions this time, but with a breadcrumb trail of history, of ancestral trauma, of a child's uncanny perception. The unseen rails were pulling them towards a final, terrifying confrontation. Chapter 13. Return to the Heart of Silence. The decision to return to the Monashee wilderness, to the very heart of the dead zone, was not made lightly. Kalen argued, pleaded, his voice raw with the remembered terror of Providence Station. He spoke of building new lives, of forgetting, of protecting Sammy. But Odessa remained resolute, her determination fueled by a grim fusion of journalistic obsession, a sense of ancestral duty to a leaner Vance, and a terrifying, undeniable pull towards the source of the nightmare. Sammy's cryptic map, found within the locket, a relic from another lost soul perhaps, was the final, chilling confirmation. The dead zone wasn't just a place, it was a puzzle, and they held some of its pieces. "We can't just run, Kalen," Odessa had argued, her voice low but firm in the sterile anonymity of their motel room. "It will always be there, lurking. What if it finds us again? What if it finds others? If there's even a chance to understand it, to stop it, we have to try. For Jessa, for Ferrier, for all the names on that wall." Reluctantly, Kalen had agreed, his loyalty to Odessa and his protective instincts towards Sammy outweighing his fear. Or perhaps, deep down, he too understood that there could be no true peace while the dead zone continued to breathe. Getting back was easier and far more mundane than their previous involuntary journey. They bought supplies, sturdy boots, warm clothing, camping gear, a powerful flashlight, a compass, and detailed topographical maps of the Monashee region. Odessa also purchased a sturdy hunting knife and a small, concealable digital audio recorder. If she didn't make it back, at least her findings, her warnings might. Kalen, drawing on some forgotten Boy Scout skills, packed a first aid kit that was far more comprehensive than Doc Gable's rustic supplies. They took a bus back towards the wilderness, getting off at a desolate crossroads town even smaller and more isolated than Pine Ridge. From there, they hired a grizzled local with a battered four-wheel drive vehicle to take them as close as possible to the coordinates Odessa had identified from the old railway maps and satellite imagery. The driver asked no questions, his eyes reflecting the stoic acceptance of those who lived on the fringes of inexplicable things. He dropped them at the edge of an overgrown, barely discernible logging trail, miles from any paved road, the silence of the deep woods instantly enveloping them. The forest was different this time. Knowing what lurked or had lurked within its depths, every shadow seemed deeper, every sound more menacing. The air itself felt heavy, watchful. Odessa's injured hip and shoulder still ached, a constant reminder of their escape, but she pushed the pain aside, her focus absolute. Kalen, his face set, took the lead, using a machete to clear a path through the dense undergrowth. Sammy walked between them, his small hand clutching Odessa's, his eyes wide and alert, constantly scanning their surroundings. His childish resilience was both heartbreaking and inspiring. The locket, containing its sinister map, was tucked safely in his pocket. They used Odessa's coordinates and Sammy's strange map as their guides. The child's drawing, surprisingly, proved more accurate in navigating the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in the terrain, the ancient, overgrown paths that didn't appear on any conventional map. It was as if the dead zone itself had provided him with a key to its own labyrinth. After 2 days of arduous trekking, deeper into a part of the wilderness that felt increasingly alien and oppressive, they found it. Not a station this time, no grand Victorian facade, no welcoming, deceitful gaslight. This was something far older, far more primal. In a secluded, bowl-shaped valley, hidden from the outside world by a ring of sheer, black cliffs, lay the ruins. Massive, cyclopean stones, some tumbled and broken, others still forming parts of a vast, circular foundation, were half buried in the earth, covered in moss and ancient, gnarled trees. It was, as Odessa had suspected, the remains of a colossal railway turntable, or something that had once served a similar purpose for conveyances far larger and more terrible than any steam locomotive. And in the center of this decaying circle, where the clock tower of Providence Station would have stood, there was nothing. Just a patch of barren, oddly discolored earth from which a faint, almost imperceptible coldness emanated. No plants grew there. The ground was unnaturally smooth, as if scoured clean. This was the heart of silence from Sammy's map, the place where the Comstock entity, in its various guises, had anchored its illusions. The air in the valley was thick, still, and unnervingly quiet. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. The silence was absolute, a living presence that pressed in on them, suffocating. The lingering scent of decay, of that cloying sweetness, was stronger here than anywhere else, baked into the very soil. "This is it," Odessa breathed, her voice a hushed whisper that sounded unnaturally loud in the oppressive stillness. "This is the source." Kalen gripped the machete tightly, his knuckles white. "I don't like this place, Odessa. It feels dead, but also waiting." Sammy pointed to the barren patch of earth in the center of the ruins. "He's sleeping there," the boy whispered, his eyes wide with a primal fear. "The smiling man, he's not gone, just quiet." Odessa felt a cold dread confirm Sammy's words. They hadn't destroyed the entity. They had merely disrupted its latest manifestation, forced it into a period of dormancy. Like a spider in its web, it was here, at the center, waiting to rebuild, to dream its nightmares back into existence. They cautiously explored the ruins. The stones were covered in strange, eroded carvings, symbols that were vaguely reminiscent of railway signals, but twisted, corrupted, interspersed with an alien geometry that made the eyes ache. There were no signs of recent human activity, only the slow, inexorable decay of centuries. Yet as Odessa ran her hand over one of the carved stones, she felt a faint, almost subliminal vibration, a deep, slow thrumming that seemed to come from deep within the earth beneath the barren patch. The entity was not entirely dormant. It was aware. "What do we do now?" Kalen asked, his voice low. "We found it, but how do we stop something like this?" Odessa didn't have an answer. How did one kill a dream, an idea, an ancient, reality-bending consciousness? She took out her audio recorder, documenting their location, their findings, her voice a small, defiant sound in the vast, malevolent silence. As evening approached, casting long, distorted shadows across the valley, the faint thrumming from the earth seemed to grow stronger. The coldness emanating from the barren patch intensified. A faint, almost invisible shimmer began to play over the discolored soil, like heat haze on a summer road. Sammy whimpered, clutching Odessa's leg. "He's waking up. He knows we're here." The air grew thick, making it difficult to breathe. The familiar, cloying sweetness intensified, bringing with it a wave of nausea. Odessa felt a disorienting pressure in her ears, the same sensation she'd experienced just before the midnight excursion had entered Providence Station. Then from the barren patch of earth, a sound began to emerge. Not a voice, not a growl, but a low, resonant hum that vibrated in their bones, in their teeth. It was the sound of the station clock, not chiming but preparing to chime, the sound of immense, ancient machinery stirring to life. Shapes began to coalesce in the shimmering air above the barren patch, indistinct at first, then slowly resolving into familiar, nightmarish forms. The faint outline of a gas lamp, the suggestion of a station platform, the ghostly, portly silhouette of Mr. Abernathy Comstock, his smile wider, more predatory than ever before. Providence Station was trying to rebuild itself. Here, at its source, drawing on their presence, their memories, their fears. "No," Odessa whispered, backing away, pulling Sammy with her. "Not again." Kalen stood his ground, raising the machete, his face a mask of desperate defiance. "We won't let you." The ghostly Comstock figure chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering across gravestones. Its form solidified, its eyes, black and bottomless, fixing on them. "Welcome back," it rasped, its voice a chorus of all the lost souls it had consumed. "Providence always welcomes its children home." The ruins around them began to shift, to change. The ancient stones seemed to flow like liquid, reforming into walls, into doorways. The familiar, terrifying architecture of Providence Station was rising from the earth, a nightmare made manifest, more potent, more real, here at its heart. They were trapped. The dead zone had drawn them back, not to be understood but to be consumed, to become permanent residents in its eternal, recurring horror. The heart of silence was awakening, and it was hungry. Chapter 14. The Last Lullaby. The ghostly architecture of Providence Station solidified around them with terrifying speed. The ancient, moss-covered stones of the ruins flowed and reshaped themselves into the familiar, oppressive walls of the station's main hall. The barren patch of earth where Comstock's apparition had risen became the polished, echoing floor. Gas lamps flickered into existence, casting their sickly, perpetual twilight. The air thickened with the cloying sweetness of decay, the signature scent of their nightmare. Mr. Comstock, or the entity that wore his form, stood before them, no longer a faint apparition but sickeningly, terrifyingly real. His smile was a gash in his doughy face, his eyes abyss black. "You should not have returned," he said, his voice a sibilant chorus of whispers, each syllable laced with an ancient predatory hunger. "But since you are here, Providence has such sights to show you, such experiences to offer." From the newly formed walls, other figures began to emerge, detaching themselves like grotesque buds. The vacant-eyed Martha Perkins, clutching a basket from which a faint, putrid steam arose. The lanky, silent Sheriff Brody, his hand resting on the butt of his oversized pistol. Timmy the bellhop, his grin stretched to an impossible, terrifying width. And behind them, a host of shadowy, indistinct forms, the staff, the enforcers, the other residents of Providence. Kalen let out a yell of fury and charged, swinging the machete at Comstock. The blade passed through the station master's form with a sound like tearing silk, meeting no resistance. Comstock chuckled, an oily, guttural sound. "Physicality is such a quaint notion, don't you think?" he rasped. "Here we are so much more." Tendrils, dark and glistening, erupted from Comstock's back, lashing out towards Kalen. Kalen dodged one, then another, but a third wrapped around his leg, yanking him off his feet. He crashed to the newly formed floor, the machete skittering away. "Kalen!" Odessa screamed, lunging forward, but two of the shadowy enforcers materialized in front of her, blocking her path, their featureless faces radiating an icy coldness. Sammy, terrified, clung to Odessa, burying his face in her side. "Make them go away," he sobbed. Comstock glided towards the fallen Kalen, his form shimmering. "You fought so hard to escape," he cooed. "Such spirit, such flavor. You will make a fine addition to Providence." He reached out a plump, pale hand, and from his fingertips a dark, oily mist began to seep, similar to what Odessa had seen used on Doc Ramsey. "No!" Odessa cried. She fumbled for the hunting knife in her belt, but the shadowy figures pressed closer, their cold presence paralyzing. Then Sammy did something unexpected. He pulled away from Odessa, his small face streaked with tears but set with a strange, fierce determination. He held up the tarnished silver locket, the one that had contained the map. "Leave him alone," Sammy shouted, his child's voice surprisingly strong in the oppressive atmosphere. He thrust the locket towards Comstock. The station master paused, his attention momentarily diverted by the small, defiant child. His black eyes narrowed, focusing on the locket. A flicker of something, surprise, recognition, crossed his grotesque features. "A trinket," Comstock sneered. "What can a child's toy do against me?" But as his gaze remained fixed on the locket, the thrumming silence of the valley, which had been overlaid by the sounds of the reforming station, seemed to reassert itself. The locket in Sammy's hand began to glow with a faint, silvery light, pulsing in rhythm with the deep, slow vibration from the earth that Odessa had felt earlier. The light from the locket intensified, casting back the sickly yellow glow of the station's gas lamps. The shadowy enforcers recoiled slightly, their forms flickering. Comstock himself took an involuntary step back, his smile faltering. "What is this?" he hissed, his voice losing some of its choral quality, becoming thinner, more strained. The locket was not just a locket. It was a focus, a key, perhaps even a seal connected to whatever lay dormant beneath the ruins. The true, ancient power of this place, a power that predated Comstock, predated even the idea of Providence Station. Odessa remembered the poetry book, Whispers from the Veil, and Eleanor Vance. Eleanor had faced this a century ago. She hadn't survived, but she had left echoes, warnings. The locket, could it have been hers? A final, desperate measure. The light from the locket flared, and a sound, pure and resonant like a perfectly struck silver bell, filled the illusory station. It was a sound of immense age, of deep, quiet power. It harmonized with the thrumming from the earth, amplifying it. The illusory walls of Providence Station began to flicker, to lose their solidity. Comstock shrieked, a sound of pure agony, his form distorting, the features of countless other victims warring for prominence on his face. The tendrils holding Kalen loosened, then dissolved into black smoke. Kalen scrambled away, gasping. Martha Perkins, Sheriff Brody, Timmy, all the denizens of Providence cried out, their forms wavering, their false smiles melting into expressions of terror and confusion. They began to fade, becoming translucent, their voices dissolving into a chorus of whispers, then silence. "No," Comstock roared, his voice now a singular, desperate cry. "This is my domain, my harvest." He lunged toward Sammy, his hands outstretched, talons of shadow. But the pure, silver light from the locket formed a barrier, repelling him. The station was crumbling around them, its architecture dissolving back into the ancient stones of the ruins, its false light extinguished by the locket's pure radiance. The thrumming from the earth intensified, and the barren patch in the center of the ruins, where Comstock had risen, began to glow with the same silver light. The ground trembled. "It's not just him," Odessa realized, staring at the pulsing locket, then at the glowing earth. "There's something else here, something the locket controls or placates. The ancient power of the dead zone, the raw elemental force that Comstock had merely tapped into, warped, and exploited, was now being reasserted, drawn forth by the locket, by Sammy's innocent, desperate plea. Comstock's form was almost entirely transparent now, a screaming, fatting phantom. "You cannot unmake me," he gasped, his voice a dying whisper. "I am eternal." The silver light from the earth surged upwards, engulfing him. He let out one final, silent scream, his form imploding, collapsing into a shower of black motes that were then absorbed into the glowing ground, leaving no trace. The ruins were themselves again, ancient stones in a silent valley. The oppressive atmosphere lifted. The cloying sweetness vanished, replaced by the clean, cold scent of the deep wilderness. The silver light from the locket and the earth slowly faded, leaving them in the dim twilight of the approaching night. Sammy swayed, the locket falling from his limp hand. Kalen caught him just before he hit the ground, exhausted but unharmed. Odessa picked up the locket. It was warm to the touch, its silver surface now gleaming untarnished. The intricate, spidery symbol of Comstock that had been on the map inside was gone, replaced by a simple, elegant engraving of a single, closed eye, a symbol of sleep, of peace. The thrumming from the earth subsided, replaced by a profound, almost sacred silence. The heart of the dead zone was not dead, but it was quiescent, asleep. The locket, perhaps, was its lullaby. They were alive. They had faced the heart of the nightmare and somehow survived. Providence Station was truly gone, its architect unmade, its cycle broken. Or so they hoped. Kalen looked at Odessa, his face etched with exhaustion and disbelief. Is it finally over? Odessa looked at the sleeping child in his arms, at the silent, ancient ruins around them, at the locket in her hand. The dead zone was a part of this world, an ancient wound. Perhaps it could never be truly destroyed, but it could be lulled, its horrors put to rest, at least for a time. I think so, Kalen, she said, a weary, fragile hope dawning in her heart. I think for now it's over. They would carry the scars of Providence forever, but they had also carried a small silver locket, a child's unwitting courage and the echo of an ancestor's warning. And for tonight, in the heart of the silent valley that had been enough, the unseen rails were quiet. The journey for these few souls had finally, mercifully, reached its terminus. The end.